Ancient roots and Chinese domination. Long before the devastating conflicts of the 20th century, Vietnam's story began in 2879 BCE. The land lay tucked in the easternmost reaches of the Indo-Chinese peninsula, embraced by China's towering mountains to the north, Laos and Cambodia to the west, and the South China Sea to the east. Lush green forests and winding rivers covered this fertile territory. Vietnamese legends tell of Emperor Hung Vuong, a great ruler under whose leadership the people mastered wet rice agriculture and bronze tool production. His descendants laid the foundations of Vietnamese civilization, ruling for generations in relative peace. This tranquility shattered in 257 BCE when Chinese general Thuc Phong invaded, overthrowing the last Hong king. Though Thuc Phong united the Vietnamese tribes and established trade with China, his reign proved temporary. By 111 BCE, two sisters, Trung Trac and Trung Ni, ignited a rebellion that spread like wildfire across Vietnam. Leading an army that became a revolution, they reclaimed their homeland from Chinese control. China refused to accept defeat. They dispatched generals and troops to reclaim Vietnam. Despite fierce resistance, the sisters were tragically murdered, and Vietnam fell once more under Chinese rule, a domination that would last nearly 1,000 years until 938 CE. During this millennium of occupation, Han rulers imposed Chinese culture, customs, laws, and religions like Buddhism and Taoism upon the Vietnamese people. Yet the Vietnamese spirit remained unbroken. Revolts erupted continuously across the nation, with structures set ablaze in defiance. The hero No and Vietnam's independence. The turning point came with a brave Vietnamese general named No. Leading his people into battle, he achieved a decisive victory over the Chinese Han dynasty at the Battle of Bac Dang River. This triumph brought Vietnam independence and established the No's dynasty. Independence, however, didn't guarantee stability. No's dynasty eventually fell to Dinh Bo Lin in 968 CE. Dinh Bo Lin possessed a different vision: to truly unify Vietnam. He introduced an imperial system, established Ha Lu as the capital, and planted the seeds of Buddhism throughout the land. His assassination in 979 CE brought the Lý dynasty to power. Under Lý Tai To, Vietnam prospered remarkably. For the first time, the Vietnamese adopted Buddhism as a common religion and expanded their territory. The Lý dynasty helped shape Vietnam's borders into something resembling the modern nation. Yet internal conflicts eventually led to their overthrow by the Tran family in 1225 CE. The Tran dynasty proved their worth by strengthening national unity and successfully defending against 3 Mongolian invasions. But by 1400 CE, they too fell, replaced by the Ho dynasty. Ho Chi Minh attempted reforms but faced resistance from within while struggling against external threats. The Chinese Ming dynasty overthrew him after merely 7 years. Cycles of resistance and foreign intervention. Despite the Ming's return, they couldn't maintain control. Vietnamese forces led by national hero Le Loi successfully expelled them by 1427 CE, establishing the Le dynasty. However, in 1527, the Moc family staged a coup, plunging Vietnam into chaos once again. The nation fractured, with the Nguyen lords controlling the south and the Tren lords dominating the north. This internal strife opened Vietnam's doors to a new threat: European invaders. The French colonial era. Initially, Europeans arrived as missionaries and traders, not conquerors. But this was the age of European imperialism, and France set its sights on Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam. Finding the nation divided and weakened by internal conflict, the French saw opportunity. In 1858, Napoleon III launched France's invasion of Vietnam. Though the Vietnamese fought bravely for 4 years, they were ill-prepared and exhausted from endless internal struggles. By 1862, France captured Saigon, forcing Emperor Tu Duc to sign the Treaty of Saigon, surrendering southern Vietnam to French control. France's ambitions extended beyond Vietnam. Seeking to solidify control in Southeast Asia and create a buffer against British colonies, they also conquered Cambodia and Laos. By 1887, all three territories were united as French Indochina. Like the Chinese before them, France attempted to replace Vietnamese culture with their own. Saigon became the crown jewel, where French elites lived in European-style buildings surrounded by luxury goods. Vietnamese farmers were forced to grow rice under brutal conditions, only to watch their harvest shipped away in French trade vessels. Despite backbreaking labor, they paid heavy taxes and lost their land. The rise of Ho Chi Minh. From this oppression emerged a man who would change Vietnam's destiny, Ho Chi Minh. Born during French rule, he witnessed his people suffering from a young age. When he spoke out against French colonial rule at the National Academy in Hue, he was expelled, but this only strengthened his determination. Ho Chi Minh traveled the world, visiting the United States and living in Paris. After World War I, he grew excited about the Versailles Peace Conference, seeing it as an opportunity to advocate for his people's freedom. He sent a petition to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who had championed self-determination. Ho Chi Minh passionately demanded rights for the Vietnamese, freedom of the press, release of political prisoners, and independence. The disappointment was crushing. Both France and Woodrow Wilson, reluctant to offend France, ignored him completely. This rejection radicalized Ho Chi Minh. Realizing help wouldn't come from the West, he turned to communist ideologies. Returning home, he found his people even more oppressed. He started the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which later became the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930. This organization united workers, farmers, and intellectuals who shared one dream: freeing Vietnam from French colonial rule. World War II and the birth of the Viet Minh. By 1940, the world was engulfed in World War II. France diverted its focus to Germany, but before the Vietnamese could celebrate, Japan invaded and occupied Vietnam. Though Japan installed a regime, it remained controlled by France. Ho Chi Minh refused to watch another country oppress his people. In 1941, he formed a remarkable coalition, the Viet Minh, uniting both Communist Party members and Vietnamese nationals regardless of their beliefs. Their singular goal: fight against foreign rule. While France battled in World War II, the Viet Minh built support and launched guerrilla attacks against Japanese forces. Led by Ho Chi Minh and generals like Vong Nguyen Giap, they employed small, fast, highly coordinated strikes. These attacks, known as the August Revolution of 1945, intensified as Japan weakened. By September 1945, with World War II ending and Japan no longer strong enough to hold Vietnam, the Viet Minh seized control of Hanoi. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before a massive crowd in Ba Ding Square and declared Vietnam's independence. Paraphrasing America's Declaration of Independence, he proclaimed all men created equal and called for Vietnam's freedom and self-determination. The people celebrated Ho Chi Minh as a national hero, but this joy proved short-lived. The First Indochina War. As World War II ended, France returned to reclaim what it considered its prized colony, only to find Vietnam had declared independence. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh refused to relinquish their freedom. By December 1946, France launched a full-scale military assault. French forces marched into Haiphong with tens of thousands of soldiers and military tanks, killing over 2,000 Vietnamese. The French army grew to 190,000 soldiers, including colonial troops from Senegal and North Africa. With modern weapons, artillery, and air support, they captured major cities like Hanoi and Saigon, aiming to crush the Viet Minh completely. The Viet Minh were numbered only about 50,000, mostly ordinary villagers and farmers with little military training. But they possessed something the French lacked: unwavering determination and intimate knowledge of their homeland. Vong Nguyen Giap, well-read and educated in European warfare tactics, recognized they couldn't defeat the French in conventional warfare. Instead, he led the Viet Minh in guerrilla tactics,
hit-and-run attacks that left French forces constantly confused and on edge. His strategy was to wear them down before considering direct confrontation.
The Viet Minh hid in bushes, ambushed French patrols, sabotaged supply lines, and struck when least expected. These attacks were hard, fast, and devastating. The French, unprepared for this type of warfare and having underestimated Vietnamese bravery, struggled against an enemy that could attack and vanish into the night. Vietnam's rugged terrain, dense forests, and mountains favored the Vietnamese. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh conducted propaganda campaigns preaching against colonialism and encouraging people to join the fight for independence. Whenever the Viet Minh controlled territory, they redistributed land from wealthy landlords to poor peasants, greatly increasing their popularity. Vietnam's support and American concern. By 1949, the People's Republic of China gained independence and established a communist government. The following year, China recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. In April 1950, Ho Chi Minh requested military aid, and China answered. They sent weapons, artillery, rifles, and logistical support through mountain routes in northern Vietnam. They also dispatched military advisors who formed the Chinese Military Advisory Group. By September 1950, China had sent thousands of rifles and guns to Vietnam, strengthening them against French forces while protecting Vietnam's northern border. As China supported the Viet Minh, American concern grew. Initially, Americans felt somewhat sympathetic toward Vietnamese independence efforts. But with the Cold War underway and Vietnam receiving communist support, they feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. President Harry Truman approved $15 million to help France defeat the Viet Minh, with more support following as the war dragged on. Now with Chinese assistance, the Viet Minh army grew to almost 100,000 soldiers. That same year, they launched major attacks in the north, targeting French posts along the China border. Using intense guerrilla tactics, they forced French retreat. This victory brought joy to the Viet Minh and solidified Chinese support. The war continued with both sides suffering, but neither claiming victory. Dien Bien Phu, France's fatal mistake. In 1954, something happened that would change the course of the First Indochina War forever. General Henri Navarre, leader of the French High Command, conceived a plan to establish a military stronghold at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley near the Vietnamese border with Laos. His strategy seemed sound. From this fortified base with airstrips, they could cut off supply lines from Vietnam to Laos and launch attacks against the Viet Minh. General Navarre believed French superior weapons and air support would defeat any Viet Minh attack. He was catastrophically wrong. General Vo Nguyen Giap saw Dien Bien Phu not as a threat but as a massive opportunity. He immediately gathered about 40,000 troops and surrounded the base, cutting off all land supply routes. Using impressive logistics, the Viet Minh moved heavy artillery through rugged terrain, dragging it through jungle to position on mountains surrounding the base. By placing themselves on high ground overlooking the valley, they could bombard French troops from above and below. On March 13, 1954, General Giap launched his attack. The siege lasted 56 days, with the Viet Minh attacking relentlessly day and night, using both conventional warfare and guerrilla tactics. The French thought air support would save them, but General Giap specifically targeted airstrips and transport planes. Trapped, dying, and unable to receive supplies, French morale collapsed. In May, General Giap led a massive final assault. Overwhelmed, over 9,000 French soldiers surrendered. This victory sent shockwaves worldwide. Dien Bien Phu had fallen, the final blow for the French army. The war had become too costly to maintain. France had no choice but to leave Vietnam. The Geneva Accords and division. France's defeat led to the Geneva Conference of April 26, 1954. Multiple countries attended: France, Vietnam, represented by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, Laos, Cambodia, the United States, and the Soviet Union. After over 70 days of negotiations, they signed the Geneva Accords on July 21. Vietnam was granted independence, with agreements that no foreign military personnel could enter Vietnam unless requested by the local government. It was a huge victory for Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh.
But hidden seeds of discord were sown. Though Vietnam gained independence, it was divided independence. Vietnam was split at the 17th parallel into North and South Vietnam. The North would be governed by the Viet Minh under communist rule, while the South, more Western-oriented, would be governed under former Emperor Bao Dai. Ho Chi Minh wasn't happy. His dream had been to see a united, independent Vietnam. Eventually, they agreed on nationwide elections in July 1956 to reunify Vietnam under one government through democratic process. However, a critical problem emerged. While many countries agreed to sign and uphold these agreements, including China and France, the United States did not. They insisted they weren't bound by these agreements, sharing South Vietnamese leaders' sentiments that they didn't want elections that might bring a communist government. The rise of Ngo Dinh Diem and the Viet Cong. In South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem was elected prime minister, creating the Republic of Vietnam. He leaned toward the West and was staunchly anti-communist. He restored the Catholic Church and tried forcing everyone to accept Christianity, stamping out other religions, including Buddhism. This made him deeply unpopular with Buddhists. But Diem didn't care. He believed he had Western support, particularly from the United States. His goal was building a capitalist state in South Vietnam. However, he wasn't a popular leader. When political opponents protested, Diem suppressed them. Anyone disagreeing with him was eliminated. His government became characterized by nepotism and corruption. People in South Vietnam began forming opposition groups, particularly communists. These groups operated far from Diem, around the countryside, mostly composed of Viet Minh fighters who had fought against the French. According to the Geneva Accords, both sides were supposed to hold nationwide elections in 1956. Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnamese leaders were confident they'd win in a free and fair election, given their reputation as independence fighters and their popular land reforms. Diem, however, wasn't comfortable with elections. He suspected Ho Chi Minh would win, bringing Vietnam under communist control. With U.S. support, he stubbornly refused to hold elections, claiming the North lacked political freedom and any votes would be rigged by communism. This refusal infuriated Ho Chi Minh and the North. They saw Diem as a Western puppet preventing true Vietnamese independence. Ho Chi Minh was determined to reunite Vietnam at all costs, even if it meant another war. The National Liberation Front. In December 1960, a group known as the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, was formed in Tay Ninh province. On the surface, it appeared simply as a coalition of forces, former Viet Minh members, oppressed communists, angry locals, and anyone wanting to overthrow Diem. Beneath the surface, however, it was heavily sponsored by Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam, with one goal: overthrowing South Vietnam's government. Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap knew they couldn't openly fight Diem's government. That would trigger immediate U.S. intervention. The only way to topple Diem was through internal means, making it appear as though South Vietnamese people opposed their own government, even though everything was directed from Hanoi. General Giap relied on tactics that had defeated the French: guerrilla warfare directed from North Vietnam to the NLF/Viet Cong in rural South Vietnam. The group was divided into two parts, the NLF as the political arm and the Viet Cong as the military arm.
War veterans who had stayed behind after the Geneva Accords led the attacks. They were experienced in guerrilla warfare and knew the terrain. Best of all, Diem wasn't popular among the people, so the Viet Cong had countryside support. They established camps in rural areas, deep in jungles, where Diem's army would never reach. But they needed weapons, supplies, and training from North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh devised a brilliant solution: the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of roads linking North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam's jungles. North Vietnamese workers and soldiers spent years secretly constructing the trail. When ready, it supplied arms to the Viet Cong, enabling the revolution. Guerrilla warfare and American involvement. The Viet Cong employed the same strategy that won the First Indochina War. They wouldn't attack Diem's army head-on. Instead, they launched ambushes, destroyed infrastructure, buildings, trains, railways, bridges, assassinated officials loyal to Diem, and created utter chaos, making the government appear weak and unable to maintain peace. Their tactics were devastating. Though Diem's forces had better weapons, they were trained for conventional warfare and didn't understand guerrilla strategies. When they tried following the Viet Cong into jungles, they were ambushed, hurt by booby traps, or killed by enemies who knew the terrain far better. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong was no longer a small insurgent group, but a full guerrilla army, launching bolder, coordinated attacks that put President Diem under intense pressure. Diem responded with crackdowns, imprisoning and killing suspected communists, raiding villages, destroying houses, and executing suspects. Yet his drastic measures only swelled the flames. The Viet Cong had another secret strength. They blended with local populations and mixed with villagers. Since they'd stayed in the South, they knew most villages. With Diem's government seen as corrupt, harsh, and oppressive, the Viet Cong promised land reform similar to the North and pledged to fight wealthy elites controlling the South. This made gaining village support easy. Villagers sheltered Viet Cong fighters, hid weapons, and informed them about South Vietnamese army movements. This support made rooting out insurgents nearly impossible. Since Diem's forces couldn't distinguish civilians from Viet Cong fighters, they sometimes acted drastically in paranoia, burning villages, imprisoning, killing, and punishing innocents. This only made Diem seem more oppressive. The Cold War context. This war wasn't simply about who controlled Vietnam. The world was deep in the Cold War, and Vietnam was a key battleground. Ho Chi Minh saw communism as his way of fighting Western imperialism. He believed a united communist Vietnam would encourage other states fighting for independence and signal that Western imperialism's days were over. But forces outside Vietnam had different ideas, particularly the United States. For America, the stakes transcended local Vietnamese politics. They were about democracy in Southeast Asia. After World War II, the Soviet Union had grown powerful and communism was spreading. In 1949, mainland China fell to communism. The recent Korean War had ended in stalemate in July 1953. If that happened in Vietnam, what would become of Southeast Asia? President Dwight D. Eisenhower was seriously thinking about this question, leading to the birth of the Domino Theory. In 1954, after the First Indochina War ended, President Eisenhower warned that if one Southeast Asian country became communist, others would follow like dominoes, collapsing one by one. Vietnam, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, eventually Indonesia and India. Eisenhower wasn't going to sit back with folded arms. He and the U.S. government wanted to contain communism's global spread. To stop it in Southeast Asia, they had to ensure Vietnam didn't become a communist state. Vietnam became the front line of America's Cold War strategy. However, Eisenhower knew this wouldn't be easy. He'd seen Dien Bien Phu fall and France defeated. If the French, with all their military might, couldn't stop the Viet Minh, how could South Vietnam's government? Worse, that government was already crumbling under Viet Cong pressure. The United States had recently left the costly, brutal Korean War that changed little, so Eisenhower was cautious about entering another war so soon. Instead of sending foot soldiers, he would support South Vietnam with financial and military aid. Luckily, President Ngo Dinh Diem was very anti-communist, perfect to hold the fort. Eisenhower offered aid and, like Russia and China, sent military advisors to train South Vietnamese troops. He spent millions strengthening South Vietnam's military. The Diem problem. However, the more America tried, the more they realized there was a bigger problem, President Ngo Dinh Diem himself. Diem wasn't popular. He lacked support from rural villages and was harsh. Even elites were slowly turning against him. President Eisenhower started doubting whether Diem could unite the country. He wasn't even popular in the South. How would he win the North over? Eisenhower needed strong South Vietnamese leadership to resist Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong's influence. But Diem's government alienated more than half the population, allowing the Viet Cong to grow stronger and more popular. By the late 1950s, President Eisenhower and his government grew restless. His term was nearing its end, and the Viet Cong only grew stronger.
Should he continue supporting South Vietnam and hope it didn't collapse? Or should the United States take matters into its own hands to stop Vietnam falling like the first domino? Interestingly, Eisenhower never made that decision. He left office in 1961, replaced by President John F. Kennedy. The Kennedy years. When President Kennedy assumed power, the Vietnam crisis awaited him, and it wasn't subsiding. Sticking to his predecessor's plan, Kennedy increased support for Diem in South Vietnam. He sent fighter jets and other armaments and increased American military advisors from just over 600 to almost 18,000. Like Eisenhower, he wanted to strengthen Diem's regime and boost economic support. But like a house on shaky foundation, their efforts failed to yield results because of Diem himself and his lack of popular support. President Kennedy and President Diem devised a new plan, the Strategic Hamlets Program. The goal was securing rural areas and winning villagers' hearts. They would build fortified villages to house locals and lock out Viet Cong fighters so they couldn't mix with villagers. President Kennedy liked the idea and supported it. But the plan also failed, progressing very slowly. They couldn't win popular support. By the end of 1962, Kennedy was already doubting whether the U.S. should intervene in South Vietnam's brewing issues. It was obvious Diem's government was harsh, authoritarian, and unloved by the people. By 1963, Diem persecuted more Buddhists and people he suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. This action led to widespread protests against Diem. Soon, plans emerged to overthrow President Ngo Dinh Diem and stage a coup. The coup and Kennedy's assassination. John F. Kennedy had intelligence about this coup sometime in August, long before it happened. He spoke to his advisors, who were torn. Some believed Diem was the best option for fighting communism, while others thought he was being authoritarian and undermining all their efforts. Kennedy found himself leaning toward those who thought Diem was wasting their efforts with his governing style. The coup in South Vietnam wasn't staged by the Viet Cong, but by Diem's own military officers who were tired of his government. They were still anti-communist, but didn't like his leadership style. These officers included General Dien Bien Phu, who led the coup, and General Tran Van Don, the then army chief. When Kennedy learned of this, he decided they had nothing to lose. If they could get rid of Diem and still have anti-communist leadership, it would be win-win. He called for Diem and asked him to sign a document agreeing to resign as president of South Vietnam. If he resigned, they would offer him American protection. But Diem had done everything to keep himself in power and wasn't about to hand it over easily, so he refused. Kennedy, using CIA help, offered tacit support to the coup plotters. However, things went out of hand. On November 1, 1963, General Dien Bien Phu led a group of officers and staged a coup. They captured Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. By the next day, they were executed. Within 18 hours, the revolt was over, and a military junta under General Dien Bien Phu had taken over. President Kennedy felt terrible. He hadn't imagined Diem would be assassinated.
However, it didn't matter much. Barely 20 days later, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy would unfortunately face the same fate. Johnson escalates the war. After President Kennedy's assassination, a new man came into office, President Lyndon B. Johnson. Unlike Kennedy, Johnson didn't hesitate on strategy. He believed fully in the domino effect and wanted to secure South Vietnam at all costs. He believed the United States shouldn't sit on the sidelines watching Vietnam fall. He became deeply involved in the conflict. He hadn't sent troops yet, but things were heating up, and everything was soon about to change. On August 2, 1964, U.S. Navy ships, including the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy, were conducting surveillance missions in the Gulf of Tonkin waters. The problem was that the Gulf of Tonkin was located in northeastern North Vietnam, bordering major North Vietnamese provinces. These missions involved secretly attacking North Vietnamese installations and radar stations. Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnamese leaders saw this as an attack and decided to confront the ships. On August 2nd, they attacked the USS Maddox. Both sides exchanged fire. The Maddox escaped mostly undamaged, but the threat of peace was broken. 2 days later, there were reports that another U.S. vessel had been attacked. Later, people would argue whether this second attack happened. In fact, in 2002, intelligence reports revealed the attack never occurred. However, at the time, it was more than enough for an eager President Lyndon Johnson to jump into action. Within days, he spoke to the nation, announcing that U.S. forces had been directly attacked by North Vietnam in international waters. He claimed the attack was unprovoked, despite their initial reasons for being there. He said this attack was a direct threat to the United States and their interests in Vietnam. He called for public support to engage fully in the war. This was an easy request. Most Americans were already worried about communism's spread and easily rallied behind their president. With this approval, Johnson moved fast. He took the matter to Congress, and by August 7, Congress gave him what he wanted, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution gave President Johnson authority to take all necessary measures to stop any armed attack against U.S. forces and any aggression. In simple terms, it was basically a blank check allowing Johnson to fully involve himself in the war. President Johnson had always been eager to squash communist movements in Vietnam. Now that he had the go-ahead, he wasted no time. He marched troops and arms into South Vietnam to help defend the government. However, the Viet Cong weren't afraid. They attacked several U.S. military installations in South Vietnam. On February 7, 1965, they attacked U.S. troops in Pleiku, killing 8 Americans with several wounded. For President Johnson and his advisors, enough was enough. This was the final straw. By March, the United States started an operation that would set North Vietnam on fire and change the war's history forever. Operation Rolling Thunder. Furious, President Johnson took drastic measures. He devised a massive campaign he believed would solve the issue once and for all, Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign lasting over 3 years. From March 1965 until November 1968, Johnson and U.S. forces consistently bombed North Vietnam. On the surface, Johnson's goal was simple: cut off the support the Viet Cong received from North Vietnam by destroying supply routes, infrastructure, and military bases. However, beneath the surface was another reason for such consistent bombing: psychological warfare. President Johnson and U.S. forces hoped such devastating destruction would force Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnamese leaders to surrender and agree to negotiations. He hoped the Vietnamese people would see the destruction and break, turning to their government to take the logical option of the negotiation table. It was no ordinary bombing. Every day, bombers flew from military bases in South Vietnam and neighboring countries like Thailand, dropping tons of bombs on North Vietnam. In the first few months, they bombed depots, bridges, military bases, and supply lines. Later, they also began bombing transportation networks, including the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, President Johnson and U.S. forces were in for a serious surprise. Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnamese leaders were not fazed by the bombings. Ho Chi Minh realized what was happening and decided he wouldn't just sit back and let the U.S. destroy North Vietnam. Once again, he turned to his allies, China and the Soviet Union. With their help, they prepared for the bombings. They gathered radar systems, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-aircraft guns to build an air defense network. With this network, they resisted U.S. air bombing strikes, shooting down several air vessels and capturing pilots. Strangely, the bombing only strengthened their resolve for a free and united Vietnam. Under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, people rebuilt destroyed bridges and roads, working day and night to repair supply lines. Despite consistent bombing, they restored the Ho Chi Minh Trail and continued sending support to the Viet Cong in the south. It was almost as though the destruction didn't affect their activities. The truth was that Ho Chi Minh and his generals realized the American forces weren't going to stop bombing anytime soon. To deal with this, they began building underground tunnels and moving more operations underground. Operation Rolling Thunder was becoming a rolling disaster. President Johnson had hoped it was fast and quick, but he was appalled to see it dragging on.
Soon, the American people started seeing pictures of bombed cities and villages in North Vietnam. The operation had killed over 100,000 Vietnamese, including soldiers and civilians. The U.S. Army had also lost over 1,000 lives, and over 500 aircraft had been shot down and destroyed beyond repair. The American people were becoming less pleased by this war. Soon, they took to the streets in protests. Left with no choice, President Johnson had to end the relentless bombing in November 1968. Ground war and search and destroy missions. However, if you think this meant he was giving up, you're in for a surprise. For President Johnson, this wasn't the end. It only meant he needed to rethink his strategy. He wouldn't be able to defeat Vietnam from the skies. He had to go on the ground to fight them in cities, bases, and jungles. President Johnson announced he was sending more foot soldiers to Vietnam and increasing U.S. presence to almost 500,000 soldiers. His plan was to directly fight the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army in South Vietnam, hoping to save South Vietnam from falling to communism. Ground forces would be sent to areas like the Mekong Delta, Saigon, the Central Highlands, and the border South Vietnam shared with the North. This operation would be led by a man who had stayed in South Vietnam for a while and understood the war, General William Westmoreland. General Westmoreland was the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. He had a plan for defeating their enemies. The U.S. Army would conduct large-scale search and destroy missions along with air support. He set up military bases in places like Cam Ranh Bay, Khe Sanh, and Da Nang. From these bases, they launched operations into enemy territory. On the surface, the plan was simple. Search and destroy missions involved helicopters dropping soldiers into jungles suspected of hiding Viet Cong fighters. The plan was to fight the enemy, destroy their bases, and quickly withdraw. However, it was harder than it seemed. The terrain was difficult: jungles, mountains, and rice paddies filled with water that made walking difficult. They were sometimes infested with leeches, and when they weren't, they had booby traps placed by the Viet Cong. This made finding Viet Cong fighters almost impossible. The bitter truth was that General Westmoreland had greatly underestimated the Viet Cong and their preparations. Thanks to all the bombings, the North's strategy shifted drastically. The guerrilla fighters moved not just deeper into the jungle, but also underground. Beneath the ground, they had an extensive network of tunnels stretching for miles. These tunnels had rooms serving as living quarters, supplies, weapons, and even hospitals. With these tunnels, they stayed elusive. Guerrilla fighters would come out, ambush the U.S. Army, and then vanish. Those who weren't ambushed or sabotaged struggled with heat, disease, and traps left in the jungle. The Viet Cong also had a way of blending with villagers and disappearing into the jungle after brutal attacks. If the U.S. Army managed to clear a village by day, the Viet Cong would return by night. No matter the victories, the Viet Cong erased them. The United States had sent troops, but there was no conventional war. At some point, it seemed like they were fighting smoke.
The tunnel rats. They were left with only one option to get to the Viet Cong: go into the tunnels. To fight this underground war, the U.S. couldn't use typical soldiers. They needed special kinds of soldiers, small but courageous men who would go underground and crawl through these claustrophobic tunnels. They couldn't carry loads of weapons except a flashlight and a pistol. Sometimes carrying a flashlight gave their position away, so they had to go in the dark. These soldiers were known as tunnel rats. Being a tunnel rat was one of the most dangerous jobs in the Vietnam War. Several went into tunnels and never came out alive because the tunnels were often filled with booby traps, spikes, explosives, and poisonous creatures like snakes and scorpions. A rat could bump into the tunnel top and unleash a swarm of scorpions on himself. A tunnel rat had to be on high alert at all times because every corner could bring an ambush and death. It was a terrifying task. While U.S. Army soldiers risked their lives in tunnels, you might wonder what the South Vietnamese Army was doing. Not very much.
The South Vietnamese Army, also known as the ARVN, was undertrained and often not well led. Plus, even the new government was corrupt at its core. While the U.S. Army fought major operations, the South Vietnamese Army had one job: maintain control in rural villages and countryside. These areas were some of the first to support the Viet Cong and needed control. However, the ARVN was failing. They were ineffective, and the U.S. Army had to do most of the work to keep the Viet Cong from winning, as it was clear South Vietnam couldn't win this war on their own. The War of Attrition. Interestingly, General Giap in North Vietnam weren't even trying to win the war. On the contrary, they saw it as a war of attrition, the same way they'd seen the battle with France. All they had to do was draw the war out for as long as possible until the United States grew tired and began to feel the war was too costly to continue fighting. Even though President Lyndon B. Johnson had Americanized the war, he quickly learned that defeating North Vietnam wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. They had bombed from the air and failed. They had sent ground troops and were still struggling. What were they to do next? While President Johnson asked himself this question, something was about to happen that would shake the U.S. military and South Vietnam to their core: the Tet Offensive. It was January 31, 1968, the date for the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, and everyone in Vietnam was busy celebrating Tet. During this time, a ceasefire was agreed to for both sides to enjoy peace while celebrations went on. However, the Tet of 1968 was not going to be like the others. Something happened that would change the Vietnam War's history. While it looked like Ho Chi Minh and General Giap were pulling through, they also knew they needed a way to destabilize the South Vietnamese government and the United States. General Vo Nguyen Nguyen Giap birthed a brilliant idea: the Tet Offensive. General Giap knew they couldn't defeat the U.S. military in direct combat. However, they had won against the French at Dien Bien Phu with a large-scale offensive. His idea was that doing the same to the United States would also break their will and show them how costly the war was. Aside from that, a large-scale offensive would destroy the South Vietnamese government. He planned a massive, coordinated surprise attack on over 100 cities in South Vietnam, including U.S. military bases. It was one of the most daring military attacks of the 20th century. Since the attack was to come as a surprise, they had to take advantage when the U.S. Army was least expecting it. What better time than during the peace period given to celebrate Tet? For the last quarter of 1967, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong prepared. They secretly moved weapons and ammunition into cities like Saigon, Da Nang, and Hue. They hid these weapons in underground tunnels and bunkers away from U.S. and South Vietnamese Army eyes. Over 85,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops moved into these cities and took their positions, waiting for the Tet celebrations. Then, on the night of January 30, 1968, they struck. The attacks were coordinated and took place across South Vietnam all at once. In Saigon, the Viet Cong attacked the American embassy, breaking through outer walls and getting into the compound, with several other fighters engaging the U.S. Army on Saigon streets. While the attack in Saigon seemed most intense thanks to the embassy attack, it wasn't. The most intense battles took place in Hue, with Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces taking control of the city. They attacked over 100 cities, taking control of most. The U.S. and South Vietnamese Army had been caught off guard. It was jarring to see such a large-scale offensive when they should have been celebrating a quiet holiday. Nonetheless, the U.S. Army responded as fast as they could. Most U.S. soldiers were stationed far from the attack cities, making it difficult to bring them down at once. Despite the chaos, the U.S. military fought in Saigon to defend the embassy and protect key government buildings. The war was so intense that U.S. Marines had to be sent to Hue for one of the offensive's most intense combats. Using the Marines, they tried to take control of the city, going house to house fighting guerrilla fighters. They had to recapture the city block by block, as every building could be a trap or potential ambush site. The war was brutal, and guerrilla fighters were once again using their signature tactics. U.S. forces would see them destroy buildings and then vanish back into the jungle or mix with the people. They didn't know who was a guerrilla fighter or which building they resided in. They had to recapture the city block by block, as every building could be a trap or potential ambush site. The psychological victory. General Giap, being an incredibly wise military leader, knew that even though they might not win the military war, they would win the psychological war. He believed that hitting so many targets at once would send ripples across the world, showing outsiders and even the American people back home that the U.S. military wasn't winning the war. The attack would be a surprise, and they'd have ground before the U.S. military could think of a counterattack, further increasing the war's cost. They would also prove to South Vietnamese people that their government was a failure, because nowhere in South Vietnam was safe, not even in Saigon where the U.S. Embassy was located. However, by the attack's end, the Tet Offensive was a military failure. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese suffered huge casualties, losing over 45,000 fighters. To worsen things, the South Vietnamese government didn't collapse. Surprisingly, they, alongside U.S. forces, were able to regain most territory the Viet Cong had attacked. Nevertheless, General Giap had been correct. They won the psychological war. Due to the Tet Offensive's large-scale nature, it rippled across the globe and throughout the United States. Despite what was happening, people back in America were made to believe the U.S. was winning the war and all their efforts were paying off. However, when news carried that Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces had not only attacked cities across South Vietnam, but even managed to attack Saigon and get into the U.S. Embassy, it was clear that it was all a lie. The American public began doubting everything they'd been told about the war, mostly because it suddenly became clear they weren't winning. Walter Cronkite and media coverage. In the past, media had relied on military briefings to report the war. However, with these attacks and calls from the populace, media began looking at Vietnam closely. When they did, they had pictures of horror, destroyed cities, body bags, and wounded soldiers. The Tet Offensive became a turning point for the American people. One journalist was able to further shake their opinions, the famous Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was a U.S. journalist who had supported the war in the past. He believed in the Domino Theory and believed the U.S. was winning. He was trusted by the people. Some even called him the most trusted man in America. However, after hearing of the Tet Offensive and the embassy attack, Cronkite wanted to see for himself. He traveled to Vietnam to witness what was going on. He realized the war was more bloody than reported and that the U.S. might not win. In a broadcast made on February 22, 1968, Walter Cronkite told Americans the war would end in a stalemate. His broadcast changed everything. If Cronkite, a man who had been so certain, was now doubtful about the war, then all hope was lost. He wasn't the only one. Other news stations like CBS, ABC, and NBC also started showing the war's bloody realities. They showed U.S. soldiers fighting in streets trying to win a guerrilla war. They showed several soldiers murdered and several others injured, taken away by helicopters. They showed several civilians homeless and attacked, and villages destroyed.
For the first time, the American people were seeing true images of the war, and they were horrified. They took to the streets and began protesting against this war they considered pointless. Those who had been in support now felt the war wasn't worth all the lives and resources being lost. There were protests in major cities, streets, and college campuses against the war, with several attacking President Johnson for keeping the war ongoing for this long. Johnson's downfall. Remember that President B. Johnson had come in with guns blazing, certain that the best thing to do was to continue fighting Vietnam. However, even upon seeing the Tet Offensive, they knew they were very far from winning the war.
His problems were compounding as U.S. citizens were now on the streets declaring they had lost faith both in President Johnson and the war itself. With each passing day, the pressure grew worse. The protests on the streets swelled. Media reported negatively against him, and soon members of his party also joined in. They asked Johnson if he really had a firm handle on things and if the war was winnable. As presidential elections drew nearer, President Johnson's popularity dropped. By March 1968, barely 2 months after the Tet Offensive, his approval ratings hit rock bottom. He was pressured to leave Vietnam by both U.S. citizens and members of his party, the Democratic Party. By March 31, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the nation. This address was a huge shock because he said he would not be seeking re-election in the forthcoming U.S. elections. Even more, he showed that the Vietnam War had cost him both U.S. finances and his shot at re-election. Despite this announcement, protests intensified. Despite losing the military war, General Giap and Ho Chi Minh had taken victory of the psychological war. The Tet Offensive had broken the American public's will to fight. President Johnson had also stepped down. But even with this great victory, they still couldn't celebrate. Several questions needed answering. What would happen now? Would U.S. forces remain in Vietnam? The anti-war movement explodes. The Tet Offensive had sparked chaos in the United States. There was an explosion of anger and multiple calls for change. Like North and South Vietnam, the United States was now divided over the war in Vietnam. Were they to remain or pull out? By the latter months of 1968, more people moved toward the choice of pulling out. Cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco had millions of Americans, including war veterans, holding placards demanding an end to the war. These protests spilled outside the United States onto the international stage. As protests continued, their purpose evolved. It wasn't simply about the war anymore. There was more beneath the surface. To keep this demanding war going, the United States had to draft more young men to join the army. Initially, people had joined voluntarily, united by a cause. But now, with more media coverage of the war, it was obvious they were losing. The question arose whether America was even right to be there in the first place. With morale lost, people were tired of watching loved ones taken to war on another continent, mostly because they no longer believed in the war's cause. While the government promised progress, it didn't seem like that was happening or going to happen. Yet the U.S. government was still drafting young men, some barely out of high school, to join the army and fight this war. Even worse, the Selective Service had an eligible pool of 27 men and had drafted over 2 million. However, those drafted were mostly working class and minority individuals who didn't get deferment through education or connections. When the populace observed this trend, they saw the injustice. These young men with little to no choice were being forced to fight a war whose cause they didn't support. This realization led to a movement known as the draft resistance. The draft resistance. On college campuses, students came out to protest the drafts. Several students in universities like the University of California, Kent State, Columbia University, and Berkeley came out to speak against the draft. In San Francisco and New York, citizens burned draft cards and declared they would not serve, showing they were not in support. But it wasn't just students protesting. Influential figures were also starting to protest. One of these figures was Martin Luther King Jr. In April 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York City. In that speech, he denounced the war and asked the U.S. to stop fighting in Vietnam and instead focus on issues affecting Americans back home, issues such as poverty and racism. He accused the American government of being the cause of violence in the world. Luther's speech was very controversial and made waves across the country. But he wasn't the only one. One of the greatest fighters of all time, Muhammad Ali, also spoke on the war. Muhammad Ali had kept silent until he was drafted to serve in the U.S. military. Initially, Ali had scored poorly in the qualifying test, but the American military, needing more soldiers urgently, had lowered entry standards. Therefore, with this adjustment, Ali was deemed eligible. However, Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted into the military. He claimed he was a Muslim and war was against the Quran's teachings. He also said he never had any quarrels with the Viet Cong, and they had never used a racial slur on him before. This statement added to the cries of those who thought this war was unjust. However, the U.S. government disagreed. Not only was he stripped of his heavyweight belts and boxing license in every state in the United States, Muhammad Ali was stripped of his passport. The undisputed champion was arrested and convicted for draft evasion and sentenced to prison for his refusal to serve. Even though his conviction was later overturned in 1971 as a technical error from the Justice Department, his stance had given support to anti-war sentiments. The 1968 Democratic Convention. In 1968, the Democratic Party was having their national convention in Chicago. However, thousands of left-wing counterculture and anti-Vietnam groups, including people who felt President Johnson wasn't listening, stood outside Grant Park and Michigan Avenue, demanding an end to the war. This peaceful demonstration eventually led to a clash with police. Media carried videos of clubs, injured and bleeding protesters, and tear gas being used. These images sent shock to families watching at home, and even more people moved to call for the war's end. These sentiments spilled out of the United States across Europe, Asia, and Australia. In the United Kingdom, people protested along streets calling for an end to the war. Students of Oxford University came out holding placards calling for an end to the offensive in Vietnam. In France, the same thing was happening. People came out to protest the war, and these protests eventually led to strikes in May 1968 that brought the country to a standstill. In Japan, protesters stood outside U.S. military bases and official buildings demanding the end to the war in Vietnam. With all the protests happening, President Lyndon Johnson was under a lot of pressure. No one wanted the war, and they had accrued losses thanks to the Tet Offensive. He struggled to justify the U.S. being in Vietnam. Even worse, his party members were starting to abandon him, leaving him alone to justify the war. However, this wouldn't be his problem forever. By 1969, President B. Johnson left office and left the war's pressures to a new president, President Richard Nixon. Nixon's Vietnamization strategy. When President Richard Nixon assumed power, the pressure to end the war only intensified. During his campaigns, he promised the American people peace with honor. But now the American people didn't even care about honor. They simply wanted the war to end and for the United States to withdraw. Richard Nixon was a man with a huge problem. Here he was as the 37th President of the United States, fighting a war that had consumed the U.S. for close to a decade. To worsen it, no one wanted it anymore. But he alone was tasked with ending it. Richard Nixon had campaigned on peace with honor, and he desperately wanted that honor. The United States couldn't just run away from Vietnam with its tail between its legs as though it had been defeated. It had to leave honorably. And that's when Nixon came up with a plan, Vietnamization.
While Johnson had Americanized the war, Nixon hoped to pull back American forces and Vietnamize it. His plan was exactly that, transfer the war from American shoulders to South Vietnamese shoulders. They would train and equip the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, so they could defend the South against Ho Chi Minh on North Vietnam. This way, the U.S. military could slowly withdraw without admitting defeat. So in November 1969, Nixon addressed U.S. citizens. He pleaded with those who weren't on the streets protesting but still believed in the war effort, yet were now tired of seeing U.S. soldiers die. He called them the silent majority. In that speech, he said this strategy would be the way of bringing them peace with honor. They would slowly bring U.S. forces home and still support the South Vietnamese government. This was the beginning of American soldier withdrawal.
By June 1969, he had pulled out over 25,000 troops, and in 2 years, he pulled over 350,000 troops from Vietnam, with the goal to fully withdraw by 1973. The reality of Vietnamization. However, there was a huge problem. As the United States left, the South Vietnamese army was left to fight North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. And as you've probably guessed, seeing American presence reduced was only fuel to the fire burning in General Giap and Ho Chi Minh. They doubled down on their attacks and continued attacking cities and villages in South Vietnam using their signature tactics. They would hit and run, ambush soldiers, and use their tunnels. While Nixon's plan looked great, it wasn't. Mostly because the ARVN, despite all the training and equipment from the U.S., were still not ready for the war. The Viet Cong had increased their attacks, and South Vietnamese soldiers were doing badly. They didn't have the numbers, and even worse, with the United States leaving them, they felt deserted and had low morale. They also didn't have firepower or solid coordination. When you add the obvious corruption in the military, it was obvious they were seriously struggling. But Nixon had made promises to American society, so he continued pulling out troops anyway. But despite this, people continued protesting. While some were happy and relieved that troops were finally coming home, others felt he should take the troops all at once, and he was only dragging out the inevitable. So several kept protesting against the slow withdrawals, holding placards that said, "Bring them all home." Now, while Nixon dealt with this pressure, he also dealt with South Vietnamese pressure. President Dien Bien Phu, the South Vietnamese president, wasn't pleased with U.S. withdrawal. He said his army was still ill-prepared, and that without American support, the scales would be tipped in favor of the North and they would be vulnerable. Despite the protests and his pleading, President Nixon kept to his Vietnamization strategy. He pulled back forces in batches and promised President Thieu that the United States would support them with both military and financial help. But that wasn't enough. The South Vietnamese army was left fighting dangerous battles they seemed to lose. One of those was the Viet Cong attacks on the Mekong Delta. President Nixon, however, continued to support South Vietnam in hopes of keeping them afloat. He sent planes, artillery, military supplies, and tanks, but it never looked like it would be enough. President Nixon, on the other hand, told the populace that his strategy was a success. In a public address, he said South Vietnam was getting more capable by the day and that their army had been strengthened. But in reality, everything was falling apart. The secret bombings of Cambodia and Laos. Nevertheless, there were still some American soldiers left in South Vietnam, and before leaving, they had to solve the elephant in the room. The Viet Cong continued attacking South Vietnam, which they were majorly able to do because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While North Vietnam didn't officially attack South Vietnam, they had been using this trail since the beginning to send supplies to the Viet Cong. By 1969, it was a little too obvious that to effectively reduce North Vietnam and the Viet Cong's power, they had to close down that trail. Once President Nixon saw this, he decided they had to strike. In March 1968, they launched Operation Menu. The operation's goal was to bomb places where they suspected Ho Chi Minh was and cut off Viet Cong supply lines. However, this time they wouldn't just be bombing North Vietnam. They would bomb parts of the trail that went through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia. Laos and Cambodia had been very neutral during the war, but there were several Viet Cong hiding places in Cambodia. To do this meant President Nixon and U.S. forces were taking the war outside Vietnam, and that was the catch. They couldn't let this be known by the American public or by Congress. President Nixon had been selling that they were moving out of Vietnam. If people knew, he feared it would bring huge backlash, mostly because Cambodia and Laos had been neutral since the beginning. He also argued it was the only way to stop Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam from getting the upper hand. In his opinion, this was necessary if they would ever win the war. They began bombing, a large-scale bombing operation. It was staggering. They dropped over 400,000 tons of bombs in Laos and over 2 million tons in Cambodia. This bombing destroyed several villages. Thousands of civilians in these locations were killed, and some were rendered homeless. To worsen things, the trail continued to function, with the Viet Cong fixing it as soon as it was destroyed. But that wasn't the worst part. Back in America, news of the bombings leaked and sparked outrage among the people. Everyone was furious. From students to activists and even members of Congress, they felt betrayed. Nixon's biggest nightmare had come true. Feeling betrayed, crowds returned to the streets in protest. Universities that had been on the front lines of protests saw crowds once again. The Kent State tragedy. One of those universities where crowds were beginning to gather was Kent State University in the state of Ohio. Students in the university started a peaceful protest against President Nixon's betrayal on May 1st. They were frustrated and angry, and the protests grew constantly in intensity. By May 3, Ohio Governor Rhodes spoke against the protests, and Kent Mayor Leroy Satrom declared a state of emergency. He also called the National Guard out to come and maintain order. But this wouldn't stop the students from coming out. It fueled them. The following day, on May 4th, hundreds of students gathered at Kent State University to protest once more. Under the governor's instruction, the Ohio State National Guard was also there, armed and ready. The protests swelled with tension, and the officers ended up using tear gas to send the students away, but that failed. Refusing to go, students threw rocks at the guards, and chaos took over. What happened next is one of the most tragic events to happen at an anti-war protest in the history of modern America. By noon, the National Guard opened fire on the students. For 13 painful seconds, they shot at unarmed students, killing 4 students and leaving 9 others wounded. Students ran off in every direction, screaming at the top of their voices. The event had happened in broad daylight, and several witnesses were aghast that the U.S. government would kill its citizens in this ruthless massacre. News of the shooting spread like fire across the country. For the next couple of days, protests intensified. Across the country, university students walked out of their classes in solidarity with Kent State University students. Nationwide, there was a student strike. The divide between the government and the people had only gotten deeper. President Nixon had to address the people. However, in his address, he showed regret for the shootings but never accepted full responsibility. He also went on to explain that his decision to expand the war into Cambodia and Laos was the right thing to do and was crucial to winning the war. With tensions on the rise, this only further incensed the people and increased anti-war protests. But this was just the beginning of bad things to come. The Pentagon Papers. The following year, in 1971, a series of classified papers known as the Pentagon Papers made their way to the public. For the longest time, U.S. presidents had told people the war in Vietnam was a war for freedom. They said they fought to stop communism spread. However, when these papers showed up, they showed that wasn't the whole truth. As though the Cambodia and Laos bombings weren't enough betrayal, the American people witnessing and having to deal with yet another one. All of this happened because of one man, Daniel Ellsberg.
Daniel Ellsberg was a defense strategist and former military analyst. He worked at the Rand Corporation and had access to top-secret files. These files contained the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam as far back as 1940. When Daniel Ellsberg read through these documents, he was shocked and decided he was going to expose the truth. This was a very dangerous thing to do, but he believed U.S. citizens deserved to know the truth about what the U.S. government was doing. The Pentagon Papers were a 7,000-page document titled Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. It was a detailed and comprehensive study showing how successive presidents and administrations had lied to U.S. citizens about the war. This document showed how the U.S. government had long secretly expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia without informing either the U.S. Congress or the American public.
It also showed that the military already knew for a long time that it was impossible for them to win this war, even before Richard Nixon suggested withdrawing troops. Daniel Ellsberg was horrified about this information and took the risk of copying these top-secret files and leaking them to the press, starting with the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times began publishing a series of articles detailing all the horrifying revelations. Everyone was shocked by the headlines and found it hard to believe the government had been lying to them the entire time. When Richard Nixon heard of it, he panicked. The document was focused on exposing former presidents' decisions, but he was worried the Pentagon Papers would only break what was left of the people's trust in the government. Anti-war protests were across the country, and he feared if people saw these, it would only worsen. So he took action. The government went to court and filed an injunction to stop the New York Times from continuing to publish the articles. But this was only the beginning. Ellsberg then leaked the papers to other newspapers like the Washington Post and St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Soon, every popular newspaper across the country was featuring news on the Pentagon Papers on their front pages. The American people across the country got to read the publications. President Nixon and his administration took the case to court in a legal battle that was essentially the government versus the press. But the government wasn't just against the press. Soon they found out Daniel Ellsberg was the one responsible for the leak. He was arrested and charged with conspiracy, theft, and violation of the Espionage Act. All his charges were going to cost him over 100 years in prison. It was a high-profile case, and it soon reached the Supreme Court. However, on June 30, 1971, the court ruled in favor of the New York Times and other newspapers involved. They allowed them to continue to publish the Pentagon Papers, stating the press had this right under the First Amendment. Justice Hugo Black declared that the press was to serve the governed and not the governors. 2 years later, in 1973, Daniel Ellsberg also got his victory. During the trial, it was revealed that President Nixon and members of his government had used illegal means to get their evidence. They even went as far as breaking into his psychiatrist's office to steal confidential files. The charges raised against him eventually got dismissed. Thanks to his bravery, Ellsberg became a nationwide hero, celebrated for resisting the U.S. government's attempts to keep their criminal actions secret. The papers he released caused people to lose whatever trust they had left in the government. They even began to question the war's legitimacy. They feared the war was based on lies and should be ended. Media also began digging up more information about how the United States had handled the Vietnam conflicts, and consequently, anti-war protests proliferated. President Nixon had lost both battles. It didn't matter that the papers mostly revealed what previous administrations had done. His attempt to have it suppressed, combined with his secret bombing of Laos and Cambodia, only left people wary of his character's trustworthiness. For him, this was the beginning of the end. The path to peace negotiations. Aside from all that was going wrong at home, Richard Nixon was quickly realizing things were also going wrong back at the war. After spending years relentlessly bombing Laos and Cambodia, it was becoming clear that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army were tougher than they'd imagined. Now, with mounting protests, President Richard Nixon and his administration had to find a diplomatic way to end this bloody war. However, this wasn't the first time they were exploring diplomatic means. The United States had tried diplomatic negotiations since 1968, when outrage against the war began. They held peace talks in Paris, but the debated negotiations failed to result in anything profitable. The reason is quite basic. Both sides didn't want the same thing. The United States and South Vietnamese leaders wanted South Vietnam to remain independent without North Vietnam. Essentially, they wanted things to remain as they were, with both sides divided along the 17th parallel. North Vietnam, on the other hand, now led by Ho Chi Minh's successors, wanted the whole of Vietnam united under communist rule. There was no middle ground, so the war was perpetuated. By 1972, the United States had spent so much money bombing, while also losing many men. The international community was also opposed to their determinations. On the other hand, while the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were relentless, they were starting to feel the bombing's toll, having lost a great number of soldiers. They were starting to crack and wanted to strike a peace deal without having to give up their position, the very crux of the contention. But the U.S. would have none of it. Henry Kissinger and the Christmas bombings. The man in charge of the peace talks, Henry Kissinger, was also Nixon's national security advisor. He would go on to eventually become Secretary of State. He had a heavy burden on his shoulders, the work of bringing North Vietnam to the negotiating table. It was a daunting task for which he had to use both diplomatic and military means. By late 1972, another attempt failed, and it seemed like the plan to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't working. So he devised a different plan. This plan's goal was to force North Vietnam to the negotiation table by intensifying pressure. The United States would launch a full-scale air attack on North Vietnam, especially in major cities such as Haiphong and Hanoi. They would also do it during the Christmas holidays, similar to what they had done during Tet. This operation was known as Operation Linebacker 2, but was eventually renamed or popularized as the Christmas bombings. With this new set of bombings, he hoped to pass a message, either come to the table or continue to face intense destruction. From December 18th to December 29th, 1972, North Vietnam faced 12 days of intense bombings. The United States dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. They bombed the capital city, Hanoi, and the major port city, Haiphong. As Kissinger suggested, they bombed railways, factories, power plants, and military bases. Residential areas were also bombed, leading to North Vietnam losing hundreds of people. The bombing was relentless. Both day and night, waves of B-52 bombers dropped bombs on the city. As North Vietnamese leaders did during the Tet Offensive, Henry Kissinger and President Richard Nixon hoped they would win the psychological war. That a large amount of destruction would force North Vietnam to the negotiating table. But despite these bombings, North Vietnam didn't give in. In fact, the leader of the party, Le Duan, declared they were not going to be intimidated by these bombings. But this false bravado was only superficial. Behind closed doors, everything was different. The bombings had been disastrously catastrophic, as strategic locations and infrastructure were the targets. Countless structures in Vietnam were destroyed, including their military bases. Several Vietnamese had been killed and rendered homeless. Families were torn apart. The city could not function for as long as the bombings continued.
Henry Kissinger knew this, and it was why, despite the show of bravery Vietnamese leaders were putting on, he wasn't moved. He was certain the Christmas bombings would work because of how damaging they were. He was sure that even though they were resilient, they wouldn't be able to stand such a large-scale attack and would eventually have to negotiate. Secretly, the leaders considered their options. Should they give in and end this torture, or were they to remain resilient as they had always been? By the time the bombing ceased, they'd come to a realization. The United States was willing to do anything to force them to negotiate. If they continue to hold their fort, the consequences may be their very end. They had barely survived, but the cities and their infrastructure had been completely destroyed. So, on December 30, they signified their willingness to come to the negotiation table. Henry Kissinger had succeeded. Despite the damage done to U.S. reputation and the scar left on North Vietnam, he considered the bombings a great success. The Paris Peace Accords. However, bringing North Vietnam to the negotiation table was only part of the problem. To achieve peace via diplomacy, they were still going to have to jump over several hurdles. One of those hurdles was the fact that both sides wanted different things. The South Vietnamese president, President Nguyen Van Thieu, was still 100% against accepting any deal that would leave North Vietnamese forces, including the Viet Cong, in the South. He believed that kind of peace was a ticking time bomb and would only give room for them to take over once no one was watching. North Vietnamese leaders, led by Le Duc Tho, their chief negotiator, on the other hand, insisted that before they would even make any agreements, the United States had to withdraw all its troops. Kissinger had his work cut out for him.
But after years of a dragged-out war and failed negotiations, he finally managed to bring the United States, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam into a peace agreement on January 27, 1973. This became known as the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement was supposed to bring peace to Vietnam and stop the war. There were several key points to this peace agreement. Firstly, they agreed that all American prisoners held by North Vietnam would be released. Secondly, there would be a ceasefire between North and South Vietnam to bring an end to the war immediately. Thirdly, both sides would no longer send any troops into the other's territories, including supplies. They also set up a joint commission to monitor this and ensure this agreement was followed to the letter. Fourthly, the United States would withdraw her troops and all her military personnel from Vietnam within 60 days. Furthermore, they would maintain the 17th parallel, which was the initial division of North and South Vietnam. Once again, they agreed the country's future would be determined through free and fair elections. Lastly, the agreement allowed that the United States would continue to support South Vietnam and allow them to build their military even after U.S. troops had withdrawn. America withdraws. The United States was happy with this agreement. For them, the Paris Peace Accord was the most honorable way to leave this war. President Richard Nixon saw it as the best way to achieve peace with honor, to leave without admitting defeat and even claim a diplomatic victory. As agreed, the United States started to withdraw all its troops left in Vietnam. By March 1973, they had removed all their soldiers. The only military men left on South Vietnamese soil were military advisors to advise the RAVN. The withdrawal was a highlight of the organized process. For 2 months, American soldiers returned daily, both via ships and helicopters. While this was a sigh of relief for most Americans as they could finally close the chapter, it was the beginning of sheer anxiety for South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese army was still very unprepared for any battle, and now that America had withdrawn its troops, they were struggling to control and protect their territories. This was because North Vietnam hadn't completely given up as they had pretended to. They agreed to the ceasefire, but they knew the U.S. was done with the war and would no longer intervene in Vietnam. So even though they didn't attack, they continued to push their advantage in strategic areas of South Vietnam, and several skirmishes continued in the rural areas. The peace accord had only helped Kissinger and Nixon fulfill their goal of peace with honor. However, for Vietnam, there wasn't a guarantee of peace, even though for everyone outside it looked like there was. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, who had negotiated the Paris Peace Accord, were nominated as recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts that year. However, Le Duc Tho would refuse to accept the prize. His decision based on the fact there was still conflict in Vietnam and the Paris Peace Accord hadn't brought total peace in the region. And he was right, because without American troops on the ground, the South Vietnamese were rendered vulnerable. North Vietnam was relentless. It was the case of a reckless time bomb left to explode. The fall of South Vietnam. With the United States gone, South Vietnam had to stand on its own. However, the South Vietnamese government was fragile, and its military was still as weak as it had always been. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong continued to cause small bouts of chaos in the rural South until it became very clear it was no longer a question if North Vietnamese forces would attack South Vietnam. It had become a question of when. In North Vietnam, even though Ho Chi Minh had died in September 1969, General Vo Nguyen Giap was still in control. The political arm of government was now led by Le Duan. General Giap saw a major chance to achieve their dream of a unified Vietnam. Peace accord or not, the United States were finally out of the picture, leaving them with only South Vietnam to deal with. He expected it to be easy because not only was South Vietnam militarily weak, they were also unstable both politically and economically. Despite the Paris Peace Accord, they never had plans of letting South Vietnam remain a separate state forever. And they knew the South wouldn't allow the election to hold ever. So he and his men began to plan. They knew that without U.S. troops, they outright outmatched the RAVN. All they needed was one good final push to achieve their goal, and they'd make that effort. That final push would become known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign in honor of their late leader. The Ho Chi Minh Campaign. General Giap's plan for this final campaign was simple. They were to come with overwhelming force and take advantage of South Vietnamese weak defenses. With this force, they'd be able to capture major cities before the RAVN could ever come up with a plan. The best part? With the peace accord signed, he knew the United States would not intervene. They soon began moving troops toward South Vietnam. In March 1975, they finally attacked, and the Ho Chi Minh Campaign officially began in Ban Ma Thuot, which was in the central highlands of South Vietnam. General Giap believed that if North Vietnamese forces could take control of the central highlands, they would be able to divide South Vietnam in half. This way, they would then be able to cut off supply lines, hence bringing the rest of South Vietnam to its knees. So they moved quickly. They launched a surprise attack on Ban Ma Thuot as planned. They used overwhelming force and, as expected, were able to overpower the RAVN soldiers in Ban Ma Thuot. In less than 1 week, they had captured the city. South Vietnam was sent into chaos. President Nguyen Van Phu was unsure what to do. He didn't have a strong military, and there was pressure to act as fast as a reflex. He then made a costly decision to pull his troops from both the Central Highlands and some northern regions and bring them to strengthen defenses in the south. This implied he'd be abandoning major cities, including the city of Hue, leaving them defenseless. This decision would go on to be called the strategic withdrawal. Once he made this decision, everything started to worsen at a much more rapid pace. As the troops pulled out, people were thrown into panic. They fled the cities, blocking the roads. The South Vietnamese troops were not organized and were further disconcerted by the people's mass exodus. Their retreat was very chaotic. Satisfied with this result, General Giap and his troops marched forward. With South Vietnamese soldiers retreating further, they easily began capturing city after city. They experienced negligible resistance as they moved on, and this only further strengthened them. The Ho Chi Minh Campaign was moving very fast. Soon, North Vietnamese forces confidently secured the Central Highlands. After this accomplishment, next they began to aim for the coastal cities in South Vietnam. They trudged forward, and thanks to the weak South Vietnamese army, they were able to comfortably capture 2 major cities in South Vietnam, Hue and Da Nang. At this point, it was clear that South Vietnam was absolutely unable to defend itself.
The final days. Back in the United States, Nixon had resigned and someone else had taken over the seat of power. Replacing him was President Gerald Ford. President Gerald Ford watched South Vietnam crumble because somehow it was as though his hands were tied. The American people refused to entertain any thoughts of the U.S. engaging itself with Vietnam. After the unfortunate deaths during the anti-war protests, the mass casualties of the war, the horror the media revealed as a result of the bombings, and revelations of the Pentagon Papers, he did not have a good enough reason for re-engagement. However, Ford didn't want to lose Vietnam to communism, and he was worried about the brutality dealt to the South. There was pressure on him to ensure that U.S. troops did not go back to Vietnam. Confused and unsure what to do, President Ford decided to do the one thing the peace accord allowed the United States to do: offer aid to South Vietnam. However, things took a sad turn when he presented a plea for additional military aid for South Vietnam to the U.S. Congress. Members of Congress refused and instead further slashed the funding, leaving South Vietnam even worse off. After the fall of Da Nang and several other cities, there was nothing stopping General Giap and his forces from heading to Saigon, South Vietnam's capital. They marched forward, defeating any defenses from the ARVN as they went ahead. By April 1975, they were already on the outskirts of Saigon. President Thu reckoned to himself that the end was near. Refusing to wait for it, he resigned and fled the country, leaving South Vietnam in disarray. What was left of the government struggled to organize a defense and protect the capital. But it was clear, however, that it was all a waste of time, even if they tried their best. The fall of Saigon. With North Vietnamese forces closing in on their victory over South Vietnam, President Ford had the shortest time to act if he was to save anything. President Gerald Ford ordered all U.S. troops and citizens out of the country. The U.S. Embassy in South Vietnam hurried to evacuate all American personnel and allies left in South Vietnam. Their government sent helicopters to airlift thousands of people out of Saigon. As the North Vietnamese troops inched closer, members of the U.S. military who were left hopped on to the last flights. By April 29, the North Vietnamese army began attacking Saigon. They rolled tanks and fired heavy artillery into Saigon, breaking what was left of the city's defenses. The remaining forces of the ARVN who were left standing struggled to put up resistance, but it was pointless now. Not only were they outgunned, but they were also outnumbered. Civilians who were left in the city, realizing they wouldn't be safe, ran to the U.S. Embassy hoping to escape in last flights. The following day, on April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese forces made their way into Saigon. They headed to the presidential palace. Those who were left of South Vietnam's government surrendered unconditionally. Saigon had fallen. Vietnam reunified. Once Saigon fell, the Republic of South Vietnam was over. The North Vietnamese were happy. This was a long-awaited victory. They had waited for ages to unite Vietnam under communism, and now it was finally going to happen. However, it would not be easy. The war had gone on for long, and the scars were deep. Also, the South was very uncertain about unification. They'd been conquered but not stopped believing in being a separate state. Nonetheless, the North took weighted steps towards unifying the whole country. They began the process of reunifying Vietnam politically, socially, and economically. Firstly, they ended the divide. There was no more South or North. There was just the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam was united under the leadership of the Communist Party. The Communist Party had the job of leading the unification process. The man assigned to head this task was none other than Le Duan. He was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam and oversaw the unification transition. He had been a major player in the war efforts and political rule of the country, especially after Ho Chi Minh's death. Le Duan didn't just want to unite the South and the North. He also wanted to transform the South and make it into a state that also believed in the communist ideologies of the North. So he and his government introduced a set of policies that would change the political and economic structure of the South. Land reforms and re-education camps. The first thing they did was land reforms. They nationalized the agricultural industry and made it a collective state effort. They wanted to stop the capitalist systems in the South. Therefore, nationalizing the agricultural industry was one of the fastest ways to do it. While most of the poor were happy about these changes, several more in the South weren't. They had spent several years fighting against communism and were staunch capitalists. They felt forced by Le Duan and his government to practice communism. So they formed a small group and started something resembling a resistance. However, Le Duan was smart. He expected that this was likely to happen. So he acted quickly. One of the few things he did to curb this was the creation of the re-education camps. However, the people of South Vietnam were opposed to the creation of those camps. They hated it and saw it as oppressive. Le Duan created these camps to indoctrinate former South Vietnamese soldiers and officials, including civilians whom he saw as threats to his new rule. If anyone was suspected of being staunchly anti-communist, they were sent to these camps. Thousands of people were eventually sent to these camps. The people sent to these camps were getting indoctrinated into communism while being forced to do hard labor and bear harsh treatment. It was worse than prison.
Some of them got released back into society after a few months, while some others spent years locked away in these camps. Several died from the situation in these camps. Many of those who fought for South Vietnam during the war were punished. Le Duan's regime ensured they were silenced to prevent them from growing into bigger problems. Le Duan knew that if he was to put an end to the skirmishes and many protests against his rule and communist rule, the camps couldn't be enough. He also needed to have a strong military presence to maintain control. He made sure that North Vietnamese troops and several locally trained militias were stationed around South Vietnam. The job of these troops was to enforce the new communist laws and policies and ensure anyone who went against them faced the consequences. Rebuilding and resistance. Le Duan didn't just focus on his enemies. He also focused on rebuilding the infrastructure Vietnam had lost during the war. He rebuilt schools, hospitals, roads, and bridges across Vietnam as a way of unifying the country. He also tried to use propaganda to unify the nation ideologically. However, it didn't seem like it was working. Many in the South didn't want his ideology, and they faced the consequences. They had their businesses seized and closed down, relatives locked away in re-education camps, livelihoods destroyed, and many of them were left destitute. Thousands of them found Le Duan and his communist reign intolerable. Their future seemed bleak if they remained in Vietnam, and so, having no choice, they decided to flee.
The Boat People. These fleeing groups were eventually known as the Boat People. Thousands of South Vietnamese refugees fled through the sea, risking their lives trying to cross the South China Sea to neighboring countries like Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia. It was a huge risk because several of these boats were unsafe and rickety. Yet people risked their lives. It grew into a major crisis as more and more refugees fled Vietnam, traversing over the sea in desperate measures. Many of them died in the sea because the boats were unsafe. Many others died from the sea's treacherous waves, from falling to pirate attacks, and from diseases or hunger and malnourishment. Over 1 million of them fled, and estimatedly half of that population died in the sea. Countries around the world had to open their doors due to the numbers. These countries included Australia, Canada, and the United States. They helped resettle those who were able to make it out alive, unable to stop the humanitarian disaster from happening. However, Le Duan didn't seem bothered by this great exodus. It only strengthened him to further unify the state, and he took one further step in that direction. He went on to rename Saigon as Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the northern leader who had championed their fight for independence and unity. He hoped this would tell the people of South Vietnam that this was the end of the old regime and now they were to celebrate their unity. However, those in the South saw it as an insult and a bitter reminder that they had lost their country to the communists. They struggled to adapt to this new system. While Le Duan did his best to maintain control and implement his vision, even though North and South had been officially reunited physically, they were still very much divided at heart. The war's devastating costs. But the refugees weren't the only consequence of the war. The war had been devastating, lasting over 2 painful decades, and had come at an extreme cost. One of the highest costs was the human cost. The Vietnam War cost the lives of over 3 million people, most of whom were the Vietnamese themselves. About 2 million of them were ordinary civilians caught in the crossfire and bombings across the country. Both the North and South military lost more than 1 million soldiers. The United States had lost over 58,000 members of its force. And while it was a terrible blow to them, it was not comparable to the woes and losses of the Vietnamese. The costs had also been economical. Thanks to the bombings, Vietnam's agriculture came to a halt. One of the saddest stories is of the rice paddies at the Mekong Delta. The rice paddies at the Mekong Delta that had once been highly prosperous were by the end of the war covered with explosives that had yet to explode and made them dangerous to farm in. Several Vietnamese cities had been reduced to rubble and their industries destroyed.
But it wasn't just about what was destroyed, it was the consequences of the destruction. For years after the war, Vietnam struggled with food shortages. Their agriculture couldn't sustain them, and their economy was in ruins. There were no meaningful commercial trades during the war, so inflation was at sky-high levels. Le Duan and his government tried to collectivize agriculture in South Vietnam to solve this problem. But the South Vietnamese resisted this move. Even when he tried forcibly, the results weren't great. In fact, they only worsened the already bad economic situation. With no choice, Le Duan turned to China and the Soviet Union for help. They assisted the best they could, but it still wasn't enough. The human toll, POWs and veterans. Several of the Southerners, fearing Le Duan in his rule, became refugees after risking their lives to cross the South China Sea. Those who stayed behind were imprisoned in re-education camps. But one of the most saddening parts of the war was the fate of American prisoners of war and those who were MIA. During the war, over 500 American soldiers were taken to prisons by North Vietnam. These soldiers were held in terrible conditions in prisoner camps in Hanoi. Several U.S. pilots were held in these camps. Even though most of these prisoners were released in 1973 as part of the agreement of the Paris Peace Accord, the issue of those missing in action still remained. For years after the war, several families waited, hoping one day that their relatives who had gone to fight the war would be found. To date, over 1,000 soldiers are still reported missing in Vietnam. But even those who survived the war still felt the pain. Even though they made it back home, they weren't given the hero's welcome that other soldiers were given. Most of the American veterans from the Vietnam War returned to a country where the anti-war cry had cast a shadow on their services, and their sacrifice was not appreciated. Several of them had to deal with trauma and PTSD. Several of the tunnel rats returned claustrophobic and with several other mental issues. They had to deal with this in silence because not only were treatment options not available, but the society they lived in didn't seem to appreciate the war they had fought in. The human costs of the war had been devastating. In Washington, D.C., the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a quiet reminder of how many American soldiers were lost to the war. There are 58,000 names etched in the granite as a remembrance of their sacrifice. Nonetheless, the war had shown the resilience of the Vietnamese people towards gaining their independence and unity. The war's global impact. But how did this war affect the rest of the world? On a global scale, the Vietnam War wasn't just a war in Southeast Asia. It was the battleground for the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. For several years, America's foreign policy was focused on containing the spread of communism. The Domino Theory, which had first started with President Eisenhower, was the fear that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, the rest would also follow. Eisenhower and the presidents after him fought in Vietnam, believing that if they could stop communism in Vietnam, they could stop it from spreading on the continent. They were right, because as soon as Saigon fell in 1975, the other states outside Vietnam soon began to fall to communism. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, backed by the Soviet Union and China, soon brought Cambodia to communist rule. This rule went on to commit one of the worst human rights tragedies in the 20th century by mass executing over 1 million people to achieve its goal of collective agriculture. Laos also fell to communist rule, and the region slowly became what the United States had forced to prevent. Changes in American foreign policy. But the Vietnam War also forced the United States to take another look at her foreign policy. The first change came in 1973 with the War Powers Act. This legislation was created to prevent the president from sending the U.S. military into war without Congress giving its consent. This was because of the secret bombings ordered by President Nixon. There was also a growing desire in the United States to prevent ever involving itself in another long and costly war. The act also set limits on how long U.S. troops could be sent abroad without the approval of Congress. Aside from that, the U.S. military also started to prepare for a war with an enemy who used guerrilla-style tactics. Their initial strategies had failed against the guerrilla fighters of North Vietnam. And so they started to emphasize studying how to counterinsurgency and understand local territories before a war. This also shaped the style of American operations, especially those in the Middle East, where they also had to fight insurgency once more. Southeast Asia's lasting scars. However, Southeast Asia had to deal with the long-lasting effects of the war. Not just Vietnam, but also Cambodia and Laos. They all had unexploded ordinances that prevented them from ever using parts of their land. It was a long war that left deep scars. Conclusion. In the end, the war was a fight for the independence and unification of Vietnam. Today's Vietnam has long risen from the devastation of the war. However, the war changed the course of Vietnam's history, and its story would echo in history for years to come. The year was 1955. The world was in the heat of the Cold War, but Southeast Asia burned with an even more brutal war. This war was none other than the Vietnam War. What had initially started as merely a chess game between the superpowers would eventually become a deadly struggle for the soul of Vietnam. It would shatter the nation of Vietnam, fill the jungles with blood, divide the American populace, and eventually cost the lives of over 3 million people. The unthinkable would also happen, a U.S. defeat. But the story of Vietnam's struggle began long before 1955, centuries before in fact, and its echoes would resound for generations to come.